Hey, this is Dr. Story. How do you stop a muscle spasm? That's a common question that I get in my office. I'm going to tell you the two things that we do in our office to reduce muscle spasm. The first is we have to understand that a muscle spasm is a reaction to something. Muscles just don't spasm for no apparent reason. The only thing that makes a full muscle contract is a neurological impulse. And very often a person will have a joint problem around that area where there's a muscle spasm. So the joint gets irritated and there are sensory fibers in the joint capsule, the actual surrounding of the joint. When it feels pressure or it feels uneasiness or anything that irritates that joint, those sensory nerves will send an impulse up to the brain. The brain then sends an impulse down to the muscular structures around that joint to tell it to contract. So that's why a person will have a muscle contraction, or we call it a muscle spasm. So if you have a muscle spasm, how I deal with that is very often I use kind of a deductive reasoning. If I know which muscle is in spasm, I know what nerve controls that muscle. I then can trace it back to the spinal segment or the joint that is actually around that nerve. So that's how we can uncover the cause of a muscle spasm. Very often stimulating that joint, either through movement, just a stimulation with an arthrostim, and I have other videos about how the arthrostim works, but either an adjustment or gentle movement if the joint will actually move, or just a stimulation from the arthrostim can very often send new sensory input to the joint, telling that joint that, hey, this is normal. That impulse then goes up to the brain then understands, hey, this joint is normal, and then there's no cause for muscle spasm. So muscle spasm, you have to understand, muscle spasm is not the disease. Muscle spasm is the reaction to the disease. The second thing we use in our office, which is a neat little trick that you can actually do at home, is to contract the antagonistic muscle. So what I mean by antagonistic is if your bicep is contracting, your brain, again, the brain is actually causing that bicep to contract, but the brain is also doing something else. It's causing the tricep on the other side of your arm to relax. You cannot have two muscles on opposing parts of the joint contracting at the same time, consciously. The reason why this occurs is because that's how we get movement. If both muscles contracted at the same time, then what would happen is there would be no movement of the joint. So hypothetically, if the back muscles are contracting, then what are the antagonistic muscles? Very often it's the hip flexors, the psoas, the lower abdominal muscles. If we can get the patient to contract those muscles, very often there's a concept called reciprocal inhibition, which means if you contract one muscle, the other muscle has to shut off. So if a person has a back spasm, very often the hip flexors, the iliacus, the psoas muscle, the psoas major that is, and the lower abdominal muscles, very often if you get the person to contract those, it will literally shut off the muscular contraction or the muscle spasm of the lower back. So those are two methods that we use in our office to help people when they come in and they're suffering with muscle spasms. If you thought this video was interesting, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and if you have any specific questions in regard to this, go ahead and ask in the comment section below, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.